Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Prospect Podcast. My name is Benjamin Clark, and I'm joined by a fellow Ben today, Ben Ansell. Ben is an academic at Oxford University, and he wrote an article for us at Prospect recently titled, "Is Wokeness Really to Blame for the Rise of Trump?" So Ben, tell us, is wokeness really to blame for the rise of Trump?
Yeah, you will be surprised that in classic editorial style, the answer to that question is obviously no.
We would never write such a leading headline like that.
No, quite. So all your readers who clicked on it thinking, I'm going to find out, is it yes, is it no, will probably have suspected the answer is no.
Yep.
But that is not the answer that I think many people in the British press have given, because people always want to find a quick and easy answer for any election, but particularly an election where something quite striking happens, which is the re-election of a president whose initial election many people had thought was some kind of aberrant mistake that would never happen again. And so I think that led to even more casting around than normal for, the way I sort of describe it in the article is, this is a whodunit. How could this incredible thing have happened? What was the murder weapon? There must be something.
In coming to your conclusion that wokeness wasn't the ultimate cause of Trump's rise this second time around, what sort of evidence did you marshal in that article? What leads you to that conclusion?
Okay. I mean, there's a few ways of thinking about this. One is just to be a really boring political scientist, and I am a really boring political scientist. So I would always say, look, there's always lots of things going on in an election. American elections are very close anyway, right? So even in the best case scenario, you're not winning by 5% of the electorate. So then what really matters is these 5 or 6% of people who shift. So one way of thinking about this is, sure, wokeness might have mattered and people not liking it to the extent that a very small number of people make these decisions. But then that's true for everything else, right? That's true for people who are mad about how Biden left Afghanistan. It's certainly true for the people who are upset about the cost of eggs and inflation. It's true for people who were concerned about crime, even though crime had actually been declining under Biden, but crime's salience and its reality often don't go along. And then I think there is genuinely a large number of Americans who are concerned about immigration and the border. Obviously, that's something that's connected to the idea of woke. Certainly in this country it is. I think less so in America, where what woke really means, when people say woke did it, woke was the weapon, the murder weapon that killed Harris's chance. What they mean is sort of HR procedures, what we now call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a sense that those had in some way gone too far. I'm sure that mattered for some people. Everything matters to some people. I strongly doubt that given inflation and given immigration, that was the defining factor. And then there's something else, which is that actually Americans don't appear to hate DEI anyway. And so Pew and YouGov have both been polling questions about Americans' support for principles that we associate with DEI, and often in these questions they literally call it DEI, at the workplace. Do you think that it's important to encourage diversity at the workplace, to bring in groups who've been excluded and so on, the way that proponents of DEI would at least describe what they're doing? And you can normally find about 50% support for that and only about 20 to 25% opposition. So in other words, there's a DEI plurality and probably majority in America. So then it seems extremely unlikely that that's the thing that really tipped the election.
If wokeness isn't to blame, at least as you have defined it there, particularly around DEI, etc., then what do you think is to blame for Trump's rise the second time? I mean, I know that you've listed there that because the margins are quite small, there are obviously multiple factors that one could point to, but what factors would you point to over DEI wokeness?
Oh, it's so great that I get to do this, Ben. It's the economy, stupid, right? So every single incumbent party in a wealthy industrialized democracy lost its election in 2024, or at least lost votes in an election in 2024. We saw it in a much more extreme case with the Conservative Party in the UK, who collapsed into a portal from which they may never escape. So I think standing back from this, we have to say, well, people and countries aren't that different. Most of the time, people vote because they think their economic life is getting better. Anybody in your audience who's been to America in the last few years will know just how expensive everything feels there. You go out for a meal in a major American city that might have cost $20, $25 3 or 4 years ago. It's now $40, $45 often. part of the problem that Biden faced is that inflation was high and rising for much of his term, although of course it declined at the end, but it was really high in the kinds of goods people notice, right? So in food and going out. And so even though it was curtailed in some other areas, there might be for things you spend money on less. So it was really salient. And I think it's inflation, just as with everywhere else, that really hurt Biden in the end.
Trump, since winning the election, and his team, particularly Elon Musk and his acolytes, they've really gone after DEI, right?
Yeah.
They've really performatively, cracked down on DEI in federal agencies, particularly. And so I'm wondering whether, you've said that Americans aren't actually as opposed to DEI as some might think they are, right? Is Trump and his team just mistaken and they think that this is a really popular issue? Or are there other motivations perhaps for their crackdown on DEI? So for instance, in distracting from some of the other things that are going on, distracting from non-progress on some of the other issues like inflation, for instance, seeming like an active president who's doing things and shaking things up. Are there other motivations here, or do you think that they're just mistaken in seeing it as the bogeyman that is going to connect with the electorate?
Yeah, so I think you've listed two obvious arguments there. The third one, which you haven't mentioned, is they believe it. Right? This is an administration of true believers. Russell Vought, who's sort of the central figure in charge of the Office of Management and Budget, but really he was the head of Project 2025, which many of the viewers of this podcast, pod show, vidcast, will have heard of. Trump denounced Project 2025 during campaign. Oh, I've never heard of these people. Oh, how dare you associate me with them? Lots of them kind of left his team, and yet they're back because there was going to be a void of kind of traditional Republicans who wanted to join Trump. And so you have the true MAGA believers, and the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 is the most true of all. So those people really believe in this. And Stephen Miller, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff, major kind of anti-immigrant figure in Trump's first term, he really believes that too. So they believe it. They probably also believe that it is popular, and I sincerely doubt that me listing Pew polls and YouGov polls is going to convince them otherwise. There's only one way we'll find out. The third one you mentioned about distraction, I'm always a bit leery about, politicians are doing X to distract from other things because there's a mildly conspiratorial tone to that. But that said, actually, the deportation program that they're trying to engage in, which I thought would be the big thing that would get liberals very upset and was going to happen, it's been a bit of a damp squib so far. The guy they've got in charge of it, Tom Homan, is sort of appearing on lots of TV shows, getting really angry about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the American congressional representative, telling illegal immigrants what their rights are and talking about how he's going to arrest her, and at the same time there are not deportations happening at the same speed. It's true inflation hasn't come down, they've only had a month. So I suspect what might happen is, even if it's not about distraction now, later on, if things aren't going well, I'm sure what you do is you try and keep hammering the button that you think gets a reaction.
Yeah, interesting. And so in your article, you also mentioned that not only are the Republicans keen to crack down on DEI, but some Democrats might also see this as an opportunity. Can you perhaps expand on that? Why would the Democrats be keen to make a bogeyman of DEI in the same way?
So the way to think about this is that the Democratic Party are going to be engaging in a kind of years-long process of internecine warfare about why they lost this election, and they of course will be looking for things to blame, but they will also be looking to win internal battles. And a group of Democrats who maybe have felt left out by what was in fact a leftward shift under the Biden administration in terms of who Biden listened to, the types of think tanks he listened to, they're kind of coming in and saying, well, you guys listen so much to all of these so-called woke groups, the famous groups theory of American politics. There are lots of kind of lobby campaigns connected, yes, to things like climate change, but often with the kind of diversity angle too, that if Democrats spoke out of line. The classic example given is that Harris was somehow snookered into saying in an early presidential debate back in 2020 that she would support taxpayer-funded gender transitions for illegal migrants. Right? That, of course, was manna from heaven for the Trump campaign later, but I doubt it changed many people's opinions. What it did do, though, is give Democrats this fear that, well, why did she do that? She did that because she was pushed by certain parts of the party and of groups associated with the party to kind of commit to their set of important commitments. And that's what the fight is about now. Okay, nobody should be making these commitments anymore because they're hostages to fortune, and the people asking for those commitments to be made are weakening the party. and there might be some truth to that, although I sincerely doubt it really lost the election for Harris.
Yeah, interesting. And so I guess you mentioned in the piece that you, don't have as much sympathy with this view that it was wokeness what done it. But you said that you do have some sympathy with some of the critiques that have been made of the so-called democratic groups. That they have influence on the party in a way that may be not helpful for them in terms of winning elections. Could you perhaps expand on that a bit? Because I think UK listeners might not have heard that particular critique before and might not really know what these groups are, because the Democratic Party is sort of differently structured in that way to, say, the Labour Party here in the UK. Yeah. So if you could give a bit more on how that relationship between the party and these groups works.
Yeah, I mean, this is really inside baseball stuff, and normally you don't have to pay any attention to this at all. But like any party that gets slightly captured by two online elements of it, and I don't know, there might be a certain Kemi Badenoch, who's in the same kind of situation right now of listening to a lot of very two online voices. The Democratic consultancy-based, strategist-based members of the DNC have become younger over the last few years, and arguably have become more attuned to certain. I'd be really careful about talking about this because I don't believe that woke is a religion, but I do think there are norms and some sacred cows that any kind of bureaucratic organization comes up with, and that was particularly true within the Democratic Party. You could see it actually a little bit in the beginnings of the Harris campaign, right? Because the Harris campaign began with separate fundraising initiatives for black men for Harris, white women for Harris, and that is a very Democratic Party thing, right? And we don't see that in the UK, right? If you did that with the Labour Party, people would be like, that's very unusual. So that kind of chopping up the electorate into different identity groups and segments and trying to build a coalition out of them is a thing that the Democratic Party have been using since the early days of the Obama era, because Obama did create this cross-class, cross-race, cross-gender coalition that the Democrats have been trying to create ever since, but without someone as charismatic as Barack Obama behind it. The groups are important basically when it comes to primaries, political primaries, presidential primaries, in trying to get candidates to sign on to particular positions. And so these will be groups interested in climate change. These will be groups interested in the rights of particular ethnic demographics and so forth. And what they try and do, generally speaking, is they'll go to candidates and they'll say, we'd like a commitment to you from this list of things that are important to us. Candidates want the support, so they sign the commitment. That's fine and dandy unless you start making commitments that 4 years down the road, you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. We saw this a bit, by the way, with defund the police, right? Lots of candidates talking about defunding the police who decided after 2020 that perhaps hadn't been as wise as they had thought.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess in your article, you also suggested that, given Trump, Musk, etc., have been particularly zealous in their, prosecution of DEI in their departments, etc., that there may be a coming backlash to the backlash. That they may have overreached here, and they may face some consequences for that. But I guess how might that metastasize? What might we see in terms of pushback to this sort of crackdown on wokeness and DEI?
Yeah, so it's a great question because actually how it manifests is not clear. So, I wrote about this backlash to the backlash. I was delighted / concerned to see that Janan Ganesh wrote a very similar article for the FT a few days later. So maybe we're all surfing the wave of thinking this might happen. I think that some Americans will look at, for example, Pete Hegseth getting rid of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, removing 2 members of the high military command in the US, the only 2 who are either black or female, and keeping all the white men, and start wondering, what's going on here? Is it really the case that the 4-star general was over-promoted, unlike Pete Hegseth, who was just a major before he got there? Or are certain groups being looked at and picked on because of their race or gender as, you couldn't possibly have that position if it weren't for DEI? And I think when you move to that kind of position, which ironically, of course, is the line that anti-woke people always say, it would be terrible if people thought that they were token candidates. But then these people are treating successful black or female Americans as tokens and firing them. You remember, you might have heard this about the air crashes with Vance and Trump talking about, it's because of DEI. I think people will find that ultimately either offensive or just strangely incompetent. Like, why are you just removing people who aren't white men. And so I think it's that sense of fairness, which I think, honestly, most Americans, even if they voted for Donald Trump, will find a bit queasy making.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is kind of the crux of this question around wokeness and DEI, et cetera, right? I guess both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, which is like, to what extent can you separate the concept of wokeness, DEI, that sort of grab bag of boogeyman terms, etc., like the substance of that, to the extent that there is one, from just straight up questions of racism and anti-racism and sexism and anti-sexism, right? There are people, you quote in your piece, for instance, like Yasha Munk and others who would say, look, I'm definitely anti-racist, I'm definitely anti-sexist, but I don't like this wokeness phenomenon. It's gone too far. It's got sort of illiberal, overtones or whatever. But then you look at some of the people in the Trump, orbit, Hegseth, for instance, who seem to see wokeness as extending to, even civil rights legislation and norms that have been set since the 60s, right? So I guess, where that boundary is a key question.
Look, this is always a matter of degree, right? So I think there are aspects of wokeness, or whatever we want to call it, in American culture, in some bureaucracies, that many people would find unusual. So, for example, there's this idea I talk about in the piece that in some very liberal groups, your order of speaking ought to reflect the kind of inverse status that your demographic and gender group have in a meeting. So essentially, white men should speak last. I think that kind of thing most people might raise one eyebrow at. So yes, probably there are some extreme woke examples that your grandmother would spin in her grave about, but not just that, like your friends down the pub would find that's a bit unusual. But I do think most of this is exaggerated, and I mean, I don't like using this phrase, but I'm going to use it, which is I think some people have been useful idiots on this front and have basically got so exercised about a few extreme examples of what they view as wokery. But honestly, 15 years ago would have been called political correctness gone mad, because I'm old enough to remember that. And that's gone through a few cycles too. They've got so upset about that they have empowered a set of people who do not share any of their self-professed liberal beliefs at all. And now those people are in charge. And, I do rather fear that this is one of those frog-scorpion moments where there's been a group of people who have been kind of scolding the woke movement, who are the frog trying to swim across the lake with a scorpion, being the alt-right on their back, and then the alt-right has stung the scorpion in the back because it's a stung the frog in the back because it's a scorpion, because it doesn't care. These people were useful to get these ideas across, and the MAGA right don't care about any of these liberal principles that they claim to be talking about.
Yeah, I guess to bring this to the UK and just outside of the US context a little bit, you're seeing similar sort of dynamics play out at the moment. For instance, I guess you see Morris Glassman, the lady here, for instance, who has for a long time had a similar sort of critique of saying, like, I'm on the left, but, I don't like wokeness. I want to see a more economically leftist but socially conservative kind of fusionism there, right? And there are some people who try to skirt that line between the two. But now you see Glassman, for instance, appearing on Steve Bannon's podcast and getting perhaps more and more cozy with that side of the equation. So I guess outside of the US context, do you think that these debates about DEI and wokeness in the US are going to impact politics here and elsewhere?
Well, I think if Morris Glassman wanted to lecture us all, he might have thought a little bit before appearing on Steve Bannon's podcast, given what we saw Steve Bannon's gestures at CPAC the other day. And I think that's precisely the kind of problem where people are too willing to run to the other side of a political debate and the extremes of the other side because they've decided they don't like part of their own group. I mean, this was where neoconservatives came from in the US in the 90s and early 2000s, right? They were the classic liberal who's been mugged. So people like Paul Wolfowitz, who was leading George Bush's invasion of Iraq, they were all ex-liberals. This is not a new story, and you do see quite a lot of people going down that road. I mean, whether there's a psychological reason for it or not, I don't know. Whether it's a kind of careerist move, which I think for some people on the left it has been. But with that said, there is a kind of more respectable, socially conservative part of the Labour Party that is reasserting itself. is led obviously by Morgan McStanley, right? Who's a highly successful, McSweeney, highly successful political strategist, and who I think has pushed Starmer a little bit more in the kind of disruptive and socially conservative direction, to avoid the challenge of Reform UK. And I can understand the political motivation for that. I do think centre-left and centre-right parties need to think more than one step ahead at a time, because every time you say, you know what, these guys have a point, and actually let's start adopting more and more of their policies, then you move towards them. You do two things when you do that. Firstly, you lose a lot of your old base, which I think is happening with Labour, and they're potentially at risk of losing people to the Greens or the Lib Dems from that. But secondly, people say, well, if Nigel Farage is right, why don't I just vote for him?
Yeah.
And we've seen that in Germany. It's true that AfD, they did about as well as expected. They didn't do that brilliantly. And the interesting thing is that the CDU, by copying the AfD, didn't win any votes off them. And Die Linke, the German progressive left, ex-communist left, they got lots of votes by being explicitly anti-fascist. We saw a similar thing, by the way, in France in those parliamentary elections last year. So what I would advise anyone thinking about this is politics is a blanket that doesn't cover both your shoulders and your feet at the same time. If you pull it up to cover your shoulders, your feet get cold. And I think that's what people on the centre-left and centre-right will find when they, to continue the analogy about feet, play footsie with the kind of MAGA-inspired right.
Yeah, interesting. I guess maybe to close things out, what would you recommend then, for instance, in, parties who are grappling with, either on the centre-left or the centre-right, the CDU, for instance, parties who are looking at this movement, this backlash to wokeness, DEI, etc., on their right flank, and are perhaps worried about that, but also they don't want to pull that blanket up too far.
So one thing I think that people on the centre-left and centre-right in Europe need to remember is they are not in America, and therefore they actually do have a different set of laws. So the Equality Act in the UK prevents the type of affirmative action policies that have existed in the United States and are associated with DEI, and certainly upset Conservatives, and are not always popular. But they don't exist in the UK because we have the Equality Act. So acting as if we have exactly the same politics doesn't make sense. If we're talking about, prioritizing people of different ethnicities or sexualities for jobs, you can't legally do that in the UK. So we don't have policies about black-owned firms getting federal contracts. Again, that doesn't exist here. So don't confuse our equalities laws for American equalities laws, which is very easy if you just look over the Atlantic all of the time. And the second thing I would do is try and look 2 steps ahead, as I mentioned. Don't just move towards whoever is shouting loudest on a given day, because you lose reputation and credibility by doing that, and the danger is you become a weak facsimile of the populist right. And far be it for me to say, but I don't think Keir Starmer is going to find most of his success from acting the populist. That's not his character type, and it's not what the British public presumably thought that they were voting for when they gave Labour a large majority. So pretending to be something you're not generally works out poorly for politicians.
Ben, you make some good points, but it is exactly what a woke snowflake would say, isn't it?
It's exactly what a Ben would say.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching this bonus episode of the Prospect podcast. To read the article that was referenced in the episode, click the link in our show notes. And to read more great journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.